Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going to be traveling back to 8th century India,
Okay.
a time when the religious landscape was undergoing some pretty big changes.
Yeah.
We've got some fascinating articles here
Interesting.
that explore how Buddhism declined in India,
Okay.
while Hinduism had a resurgence.
Uh-huh.
And a key figure in all this is Shankaracharya.
It's a really intriguing period, isn't it? By 788 AD, Buddhism was already kind of losing ground in India,
Right.
although it had a strong presence in other parts of Asia.
That's right. It had really taken root in places like China, Korea, and Japan, evolving into like distinct schools like Mahayana Buddhism.
Right.
And of course, you have Tibetan Buddhism emerging with its unique blend of Indian and Chinese influences.
Yeah.
So Buddhism was flourishing elsewhere, but back in its birthplace, it was facing some serious challenges.
Exactly. And this is where Shankaracharya enters the picture.
Right.
He's often credited with reviving Hinduism and championing a school of thought called Advaita Vedanta.
Okay, now that sounds complicated.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. It's a non-dualistic Hindu philosophy, meaning it emphasizes the unity of Brahman, the ultimate reality, and Atman, the individual soul.
Okay.
Imagine a drop of water merging back into the ocean. That's the basic idea.
So he was saying that we're all essentially part of this one big universal energy.
Precisely. And that really resonated with people.
Yeah.
Shankaracharya traveled extensively, debated scholars, and established these important monastic centers called mathas. He wasn't just a thinker, he was a doer.
And his writings were pretty influential too, right?
Absolutely. They helped solidify the foundation of what we now know as Hinduism.
Right.
But it's important to remember that Shankaracharya was part of a larger trend.
Okay.
There were multiple factors contributing to Buddhism's decline in India.
Like what? What else was going on at the time?
Well, for one, Buddhism was losing royal patronage.
Yeah.
Many Buddhist institutions relied heavily on support from rulers, and as that support dwindled, their influence waned.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's hard to thrive without resources and backing.
And then there were internal divisions within Buddhism itself.
Okay.
Different schools of thought emerged, leading to disagreements and fragmentation.
Right.
There's like cracks appearing in the foundation.
So you have this combination of external pressures and internal weaknesses.
Yeah.
And that's creating an opportunity for Hinduism to gain ground.
Exactly. And it's interesting to note that around this time, Islam also started to make its presence felt in India.
Okay.
Although the major invasions came later, this added another layer of complexity to the religious landscape.
Wow. So much happening at once. It sounds like a real turning point in history.
It really was.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets even more intriguing.
Okay.
Some sources suggest that several Hindu temples, particularly in Ayodhya, might have originally been Buddhist shrines that were converted during this period.
Hold on. Hindu temples built on top of Buddhist shrines.
Yeah.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is, and it really highlights the complexities of this era.
Yeah.
Religious identities weren't always fixed.
Right.
And transitions often involved a blending of traditions and practices.
It reminds us that history is rarely neat and tidy.
Right.
It's more like a tangled web of influences and interactions.
Precisely. So while Buddhism was facing these challenges, Hinduism was undergoing its own transformations, becoming more attractive to the masses.
Okay.
One key development was the rise of the Bhakti movement.
I've heard of Bhakti,
Yeah.
but I don't really know much about it.
Okay.
What was so appealing about it?
Well, Bhakti emphasizes a personal connection with deities like Vishnu and Shiva.
Right.
It was a more emotionally engaging and accessible form of religious expression compared to some of the more abstract philosophical concepts in Buddhism.
So it was about having a direct relationship with the divine rather than focusing solely on intellectual understanding.
You got it. It appealed to people's hearts as well as their minds. And it offered a sense of comfort and hope during a time of great change and uncertainty.
I can see why that would be appealing.
Yeah.
And alongside Bhakti, there was also a renewed interest in Vedic rituals and temple worship. Right?
Yes, exactly. Hinduism was becoming more structured and ritualistic, which provided a sense of community and tradition that drew people in.
It's interesting to contrast this with Buddhism.
Yeah.
Which often emphasized meditation and monastic life. Those practices might have seemed less accessible to the average person.
That's a great point. And here's another key element of Hinduism's success. Its adaptability.
Right.
Hinduism readily integrated local beliefs and practices,
Right.
which broadened its appeal and allowed it to encompass a wider range of spiritual expressions.
It's like it had this amazing ability to absorb and adapt, constantly evolving to meet the changing needs of the people.
And that brings us to a fascinating twist.
Okay.
What if I told you that the Buddha himself was incorporated into Hindu mythology?
Wait, you mean the founder of Buddhism became part of the Hindu pantheon?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, he was absorbed as an avatar of Vishnu.
Okay.
It's almost as if they were trying to neutralize a competing belief system by saying, hey, he's one of ours.
That's a pretty clever strategy.
It is, and it raises some really interesting questions about the very nature of religious boundaries.
Yeah.
And how fluid they can be, especially during times of transition.
This is giving me a whole new perspective on how religions evolve and interact with each other.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
It's all about challenging assumptions and exploring the complexities of history.
Well, I'm definitely hooked. This is way more than just a list of facts and dates.
It's about understanding the human story behind those facts and dates.
Right.
And we're just getting started.
Right.
We're just getting started.
Okay. So we're talking about this fascinating period in India where Buddhism's influence is waning and Hinduism is on the rise. One of the things that really struck me was this idea that some Hindu temples might have originally been Buddhist shrines.
It's a fascinating concept, isn't it? It really speaks to the fluidity of religious boundaries, especially in times of transition. What might have been a Buddhist shrine in one era could easily become a Hindu temple in another, and often elements of the previous tradition would be incorporated into the new one.
You mentioned Ayodhya earlier. Are there any specific examples of temples there that might have undergone this kind of transformation?
Well, the historicity of some claims is debated, but it's interesting to look at the case of the Hanuman Garhi temple.
Okay.
Some scholars suggest that it might have been built upon the remains of a Buddhist structure.
Wow, so you could be standing in a place of worship today, and beneath your feet are layers of history and different religious practices. It makes you wonder how many other places might have similar stories hidden beneath the surface.
Exactly, and it highlights the challenges historians face when trying to piece together the past. We have archaeological evidence, textual sources, and local traditions, but often they offer conflicting or incomplete narratives. It's like a puzzle with missing pieces.
We have to rely on interpretation and a bit of detective work, it sounds like.
Yeah.
But speaking of reinterpretations, we've been talking a lot about Shankaracharya and his role in this period. I'm curious to delve a bit deeper into his legacy. We've touched on the idea that it's both celebrated and contested.
Right.
What are some of the different perspectives on his impact?
Well, he's often hailed as this brilliant philosopher who revitalized Hindu thought, but there are other viewpoints, particularly those from scholars who focus on the decline of Buddhism, that are much more critical.
In what way? What are some of their criticisms?
Well, they argue that he wasn't just reviving Hinduism, he was actively dismantling Buddhism. They point to accounts of him converting Buddhist shrines into Hindu temples and engaging in debates with Buddhist scholars where the goal was less about dialogue and more about asserting dominance.
So it wasn't necessarily a peaceful or respectful exchange of ideas.
It seems that for Shankaracharya, establishing the supremacy of his philosophical views was paramount. He saw Advaita Vedanta as the purest form of Hinduism, and anything that challenged that was seen as an obstacle.
It's interesting to think about how much of a role personality and individual ambition might have played in these larger religious shifts. It's not just abstract philosophical debates, it's real people driving these changes.
Absolutely, and it's important to remember the historical context. Religious competition was fierce in 8th century India.
Right.
Different groups were vying for followers, resources, and influence.
So it's not surprising that there would be tensions and even conflicts. It wasn't just this polite philosophical discussion happening in a vacuum.
Exactly. We need to avoid simplistic narratives that paint one side as entirely good and the other as entirely bad. History is rarely that black and white. It's a complex tapestry of motivations, actions, and consequences.
So while there's no consensus on the extent of Shankaracharya's role in the decline of Buddhism, it's clear that he was a major figure in this transformative period.
His teachings and actions had a profound impact on the religious landscape of India. There's no denying that.
But I'm also curious about the broader implications of this religious shift.
Yeah.
What can we learn from the decline of Buddhism and the rise of Hinduism in India beyond the specifics of this particular time and place?
One key takeaway is that religious dominance is not static.
Okay.
It can change over time, influenced by a variety of factors. Social, political, economic, and intellectual trends all play a part.
Buddhism, once a major force in India, lost its foothold, while Hinduism adapted and evolved to become the dominant faith. What does that tell us about how religions succeed or fail?
It highlights the importance of adaptability and responsiveness to the needs of the people. Hinduism was able to integrate local beliefs and practices, making it more accessible and appealing to a wider range of people.
Okay.
And as we discussed, the rise of the Bhakti movement, with its emphasis on personal devotion, offered a path that resonated deeply with people on an emotional level.
So it's not just about having a compelling set of doctrines, it's also about how those doctrines are lived and experienced by everyday people.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that these religious shifts had real-world consequences for people's lives,
Yeah.
shaping their beliefs, practices, and even social structures.
Right.
It wasn't just an abstract intellectual exercise. It had a profound impact on how people lived and interacted with each other.
It's a reminder that religion isn't just a personal matter of faith.
Right.
It's a powerful social and cultural force that can shape societies in profound ways.
Another important insight is that religious interactions are rarely simple or straightforward.
Yeah.
They involve competition, cooperation, assimilation, and sometimes even conflict.
We've seen all of that in our discussion of 8th century India.
Yeah.
Buddhist and Hindu communities weren't operating in isolation. They were constantly interacting, influencing each other, and sometimes clashing.
And these complex interactions continue to shape the religious landscape of India and the world today.
Right.
Understanding the historical context of those interactions helps us make sense of contemporary religious dynamics.
It's like having a key to unlock a deeper level of understanding.
Exactly. It allows us to appreciate the multifaceted nature of belief systems and see how they evolve and adapt over time.
So why should we care about these religious shifts that occurred centuries ago? What's the relevance for us today?
Well, for one, it helps us understand the historical roots of the religious landscape we see around us.
Okay.
Hinduism's dominance in India, the spread of Buddhism to other parts of Asia, the ongoing interactions between these traditions, all of that has its origins in this pivotal period.
It's like tracing the branches of a tree back to its roots. Understanding the past gives us a deeper appreciation for the present.
And studying these historical shifts can teach us valuable lessons about the dynamics of religious change, the fluidity of religious boundaries, and the complex interplay of factors that can lead to the rise and fall of belief systems.
It's a reminder that nothing is static, that beliefs and practices evolve over time, and that our understanding of religion needs to be flexible and nuanced.
And perhaps most importantly, it encourages us to engage with religious diversity, with empathy, curiosity, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Instead of viewing different religions as monolithic entities, we can appreciate their internal diversity, their historical evolution, and the complex ways in which they have interacted and continue to interact.
Absolutely. It's about embracing complexity and nuance.
Well, this has been a real eye-opener for me. We started with what seemed like a simple question. How did Hinduism become the dominant religion in India? But the answer is so much more than a list of dates and facts. It's a story about human ambition, cultural exchange, adaptation, and the enduring power of belief. We've been on this incredible journey through 8th century India, exploring how Hinduism rose to prominence while Buddhism's influence declined.
Yeah.
It's been fascinating to unpack all these complex factors.
It really highlights how dynamic and interconnected religious landscapes can be, doesn't it?
Right.
And speaking of interconnection,
Yeah.
I think it's time we circle back to one of the most surprising elements we've touched on: the absorption of the Buddha into Hindu mythology.
Yeah, that really blew my mind.
Yeah.
How could the founder of one religion become part of another religion's pantheon?
Right.
It seems almost counterintuitive.
It might seem that way, but it speaks to the adaptable nature of Hinduism.
Okay.
In this case, the Buddha is considered an avatar of Vishnu, one of the primary deities in Hinduism.
So they basically incorporated him into their own belief system.
Right.
Was this a common strategy?
It wasn't uncommon for religious traditions to borrow elements from each other, especially during periods of cultural exchange and competition.
Right.
It could be a way to bridge divides, assimilate new ideas, or even neutralize potential rivals.
So in a way, it could be seen as a form of religious diplomacy.
That's a great way to put it. And it wasn't just a matter of incorporating the Buddha into their mythology.
Yeah.
Some Buddhist practices like meditation were also adopted by Hindu groups.
So even though Buddhism declined as a distinct religion in India, its influence lived on in these subtle ways. It's like its essence was woven into the fabric of Hinduism.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful reminder that religious boundaries aren't always as rigid as we might think.
Right.
There can be a lot of fluidity and cross-pollination between traditions, especially over long periods of time.
It makes you wonder how much of what we consider pure religious doctrine is actually the result of centuries of cultural exchange and blending of ideas.
That's a really insightful point. It challenges us to look beyond simplistic categories and appreciate the complex tapestry of influences that shape religious beliefs and practices.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about.
It has for me too.
We started with the question of how Hinduism rose to prominence in India, and we've uncovered so much more than just a simple answer.
We've explored the role of influential figures like Shankaracharya, the impact of social and political changes, the adaptability of Hinduism, and the fascinating phenomenon of religious syncretism.
Right. It's been a journey through history, philosophy, and even a bit of human psychology.
It really has.
And for me, it's highlighted how important it is to approach history with an open mind and a willingness to challenge our assumptions.
I couldn't agree more. It's about embracing complexity and recognizing that the past is never a closed book.
Right.
There's always more to learn and explore.
And for you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about this fascinating period in history. Maybe it'll inspire you to learn more about the evolution of religious thought in India, or explore how different belief systems have interacted and influenced each other throughout history.
Because ultimately, understanding the past helps us make sense of the present and navigate the complex world we live in.
So keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and most importantly, never stop learning.